anyone who wishes to ask a question would raise their hand. And once I see the hand raised, I will prompt you to unmute yourself and pose a question to the presenter, to Dr. Bashir, who will then respond. And I see straight away Dr. Munzila Reza has her hand up, so I'm going to ask her to unmute herself and ask the question.
Thank you. Thank you for that presentation. It was really informative. My question was, I'm sorry if you mentioned this already. So it sounds like the curse of Ham is the kind of the source of anti-Black sentiment in the Islamicate that you were mentioning. And what is that? So is the earliest refutation of that Jahiz, or were there works much sooner as well, specifically of that?
Sure. So, I mean, I'd probably say that I'd argue that the curse of Ham wasn't necessarily the source of anti-Black sentiment within the Islamicate. It certainly was. It certainly played a part in, for example, as I mentioned in the transatlantic slave trade. It certainly was kind of key to that, but it didn't. The narrative didn't sit well with many Muslims. I'd argue for that reason, and I mentioned some of them in. When I ran through some of the refutations. Jahiz is probably one of the earliest, yeah, and it's quite an early text. Prior to that, I haven't really come across anything before that. But again, I mean, what's interesting to me is when does the curse of Ham begin to gain traction in terms of its kind of permeation within the Islamicate, right? So, I mean, is it there in the early period? It certainly doesn't seem so. So I'm not sure. I mean, I think that in itself is probably something that's kind of worth assessing. When does the curse of Ham begin to kind of gain traction within Islamic texts in terms of a genealogical study of that would be interesting. But yeah, I mean, Jahiz is certainly one of the earliest that I've come across. I'd be happy to kind of be corrected if there's earlier works than that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Waji has his hand up.
Salam, Doc. Thank you for that presentation. I just wanted to ask, you spoke about Muslim racism. Could we say that Muslim racism could be a response or opposition to colonialism? Because I'm linking to what you said about in regards to problematic readings and the Orientalist imagery. Yeah, and then the second part would be, and what constitutes racist or a racist or racism? Would it be defined by the people in charge?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I'd say, sorry, there were two parts to that question. Can you just repeat the first one again? It's just last minute. Yeah.
Yeah, the first one was just when you spoke about Muslim racism, could it be seen
a response?
Response, yeah.
So what I'd say is, look, the thing I was trying to get across, and I don't know how well I have or haven't done this, is that, I mean, I think it's problematic to look at race as universal. The idea that race, because again, like people often use the term race or racism as almost kind of synonymous with notions of discrimination more generally, right? But I'd argue that race kind of emerges out of European colonialism and modernity more generally, because you have a very distinct idea of what constitutes different races, scientific racisms born around that period. And you have a very, as I said, a distinct idea of what whiteness is, blackness is linked to Africa. You have arguments that, basically borders set up so that intellectually speaking, at least, or conceptually speaking, that can't be surpassed or transgressed in a sense. And I don't think that you can see similar things, as I mentioned, in the pre-modern Islamicate. Okay, you see far more fluidity and flexibility, and you don't have these distinct races, as I mentioned. So yeah, I mean, I certainly think our modern kind of conversations about racism have definitely been impacted by those understandings of race. And you can see kind of the negative views towards certain communities in the modern day. Absolutely, they've been impacted by those discourses. But the thing I was really trying to emphasize is that they haven't always existed. And sometimes, occasionally, when people are trying to challenge, quite legitimately racism within Muslim communities, they can occasionally make a mistake of assuming that these types of ideas have always existed, and I'd argue that they probably haven't. So yeah, there's certainly been an impact of that. And the second question was, sorry.
Yeah. So would what racism is defined by, would it be by the people in charge then in a certain era?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. So that's absolutely the case. So the reason the world is structured the way it is because essentially, Europeans were very good at colonization and empire building. 3/4 of the Muslim world were colonized during that point, and that's the reason. I mean, we're conversing in English today because of that, right? That's the lingua franca for a reason. So any societies are always governed by the hegemonic kind of leaders or thoughts of that period, and it's absolutely the case that whoever is in charge is ultimately dictating the ideologies that are popular at that time, I guess, is one way of putting it. So yes, I think in response to that.
Thank you. Also, just to remind the attendees, if you don't have access to a mic, of course, feel free to write your question in the chat feature, and we will take it up from there as well. Dr. Bashir, I just had a question myself. I mean, you did, in your what seems to be a defense of the Islamicate in terms of the face of perceptions or accusations of anti-black racism, you cited companions of the Prophet, historical texts, family members of the Prophet even, who are revered. But is it, I wonder, a bit too reductive to say that the perception of anti-black racism within the Arab world, the ancient Arab world, or the Islamicate, is formed by a European superimposition of race? Because, I mean, although that might be a factor, because we know that, I mean, even in today's discourse about racism, which is quite topical these days, we see black people often, to cite how far anti-black racism is ingrained, even turn to instances of language and the language, how it's ingrains anti-black stereotypes and negativity. Well, when we look at the Quran, we also find within the Quran itself about describing the day of judgment, where faces will turn black and faces will turn white as a result of their deeds. And the language is geared, of course, I would say, perhaps, or suggest that the Quran is speaking to the language of the time. So might it be the case that the language already consisted of blackness having pointing towards negativity at that time, or is that an unfair point to make?
Sure. I mean, I think it's certainly a fair point to make. Absolutely. And of course, there are these kind of references. I think the key question for me would be, to what extent are those references applied to? I mean, there's a couple of things. Firstly, as I mentioned, when we're talking about blackness, firstly, when we're talking about blackness and black communities, we're not necessarily even just referencing Africans, as I made kind of a point to when discussing Jahiz and others as Al-Kisai. But specifically on that point, I mean, I would probably suggest that certainly our own readings, we're not kind of insulated from the dominant discourses in our times, and our linkages of blackness in that way may not necessarily have been read in the same way in the pre-modern Islamicate. That would probably be my response to that. I mean, whether or not they would have kind of seen it in that same context, in a negative way, as referring to kind of those types of communities, or seeing a link towards that type of description and black communities, is something I'd kind of struggle with. I'd like to see that type of causality before it's kind of assumed. But that would probably be my response to that. But yeah, of course, it's a legitimate kind of question, and as mentioned, Goldenberg in his book on this kind of makes a very similar type of argument regarding, you can see blackness always being seen as a negative. Again, whether that correlates or corresponds to that blackness understood in the same way as describing black communities is probably something, as I said, I'm not too sure about.
Thank you so much. Funnily enough, we have Mahdi are asking pretty much the identical question on the chat on the chat feature as well.
Okay.
So I mean,
Yeah.
what it does tell us, I mean, apart from the Quranic reference there in Surah Al Imran,
Sure.
aside from that, and of course other places, the hadith literature also has certain instances of, for example, when someone's sinning, a black spot entering upon their heart, and that would be erased when they seek forgiveness. So, I mean, um, yeah, like you said fairly, whether or not the correlation is made to black communities is probably a stretch which has
Well,
been
I suppose,
unfounded so far.
yeah, I suppose my response would be, as I said, when we use these terms, again, we're using them in certain contexts, right? So until we appreciate the context in which a certain term is being used, it's very difficult to kind of ascertain exactly what the connotations are and how it's being understood. So, I mean, to kind of give an example, if we say, where is the chair? Obviously, it has different semantic meanings depending on what you mean by that, and you'll understand that in that given conversation. But if it's just written down, you can probably interpret it in slightly different ways. You could be the chair of a meeting. It could be a physical chair that I'm referring to. And in that same way, I guess that would be my response to that. I mean, whether or not that same blackness in terms of the negative blackness, the black spot on the heart, or the blackness in terms of faces being blackened, were seen in that way. I'm not so sure about, because as I mentioned, there were certain times when Arabs described themselves as black, right? And if it was the case that blackness had this strong negativity attached to it, would they describe themselves as black as opposed to the Persians who were red, ahmar, or other colors, you know? And I think that's where I probably I slightly take issue with it. But I mean, as I said, it's still an interesting point to make.
Also, before I ask others about the questions, you did cite a couple of pictures, I think from Bernard Lewis, etc., which
Sure.
kind of, sought to almost accuse the society of racism. In your research, have you found counter pictures of, where black and non-black or whiter skinned Arabs are seen in that kind of images from that time, which doesn't portray the black people as in a negative sense at that time?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that was I think that was the point I was actually trying to make. Sorry if it didn't come across clearly. Like, so
No, but I mean, there are existence of other such pictures which don't or paintings from that time which don't have that kind of connotation.
Yeah, so I mean, I think again, I don't think I'm necessarily disagreeing with what you're saying. I agree. That's the point I was probably trying to make, which is that there are numerous pictures that you can see, because again, the kind of argument that I was making is that, we're reading race into the Islamicate in a way that it probably didn't exist at that time, which is to say that, of course, there are pictures in which there are black and white depicted in that way, but there are equally pictures in which black figures are seen as dominating white figures. And the point that I was trying to make was that you can see the kind of expedient usage of particular types of imagery that serves particular purposes, right? So when some of these kind of Orientalist figures are attempting to, demonstrate that Muslims are terrifying and Muslims were taking white slaves, Muslims are depicted as black. And when they're trying to depict Muslims as being racists towards blacks, then Muslims are depicted as white, and they use those types of images. So of course, these types of images certainly do exist, and they're used, as I said, in kind of various ways, rather inconsistently.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to open. Are there any other further questions for Dr. Bashir before we wind up? If there are, please feel free to unmute your mics. There is one more question from Dr. Ali Zabojani. Yeah, go ahead.
Salam. Apologies for the beginning of the talk. So hopefully I caught the core argument, and I think it's a point well made that some Orientalists are using tropes of anti-Muslim or Muslim racist, Muslim anti-black discourse, to normalize and to qualify and relativize their own treatment of or of blacks. I think that's a point well made. But as part of the argument, you said that they've got this selective use of sources, and they're not referring to this geographical widespread literature talking about black virtue. But this, at the same time, is there not a double-edged sword to that argument, Harun? Because if we're talking about this widespread literature of black virtue, does that not suggest, that there was a need, scholars from Jahiz to Suyuti to Mullah Ali, felt a need to write about black virtue. So
Sure.
does this suggest that there was a problem in society, regarding blackness?
I mean, look, again, I don't disagree with what you're saying insofar as, again, I don't see it as necessarily a double-edged sword. The point that I'm making isn't necessarily that there was not anti-black sentiment that can be located in Islamicate. It's simply that, I guess my overall argument is racism as the way we understand it now can't be projected backwards onto Islamic history, because the logics that govern those societies differ greatly from the logics that govern our societies and the way we understand it. So, of course, it's not to say that black sentiment. For example, he writes his piece is because he's become one of the chief qadis in the Ottoman Empire, which again is interesting, right? He's originally a black slave who's freed and then becomes the Qadi of, he's described at one point as the most powerful man in the Ottoman Empire. But that's not to say he doesn't face obstacles on the way, and some of his kind of colleagues are very jealous of him, and they use derogatory terms for him. And in response to that, he kind of refutes that. But the key aspect of this is really, for me, about agency. You can see that Muslims and black Muslims and non-black Muslims were writing about color in this way, in which they saw blackness as an inherent part of Islam and not something separate to it. And in doing so, I think what that shows is, and there's other kind of literatures you could probably point to, in which Islam isn't just simply linked to one particular ethnicity, or historically hasn't been. And I think, again, for me, one of the reasons that this trope is kind of very dominant is because of the kind of genealogical history of the way religion has been constructed in the Western academy for a particular purpose, right? And so yeah, I mean, that would be my response. I don't disagree with what you're saying at all. Or the point that I'm making is not that there were, that it was some sort of racial utopia and no one was ever horrible to one another. I think, human beings are human beings, and you'll find good and you'll find bad. It's simply to kind of distance or unmoor this type of narrative that Islam is, simply an extension of Arab supremacy, which is very dominant within lots of these works. As I mentioned, if you pick up someone like Patricia Crone, she uses Arab and Muslim synonymously, and in which she discusses, early Arab conquests, for example. Which again, for me, sorry to kind of digress and go talk about this a little bit longer, but I mean, racialization is part of a broader problem for me, in which when Muslim almost becomes a peripheral kind of analytical tool. So when you look at some of these history works and they refer to the Umayyads as the Arab Caliphate and the Abbasids as the Persian Caliphate and the Ottomans as the Turks, the fact that the Muslim almost becomes secondary and not particularly important, the thing that's kind of key becomes ethnicity, right? And, I think it's kind of key to challenge those types of approaches, because again, they're reading some history through a very particular lens in which Muslim almost becomes insignificant. Sorry, I know that wasn't the question, but
Thank you so much. Are there any further questions for Dr. Bashir on this topic? If there aren't, we have hit 4 o'clock, and I know we're all fasting, so I don't want to keep Dr. Bashir much longer. If there aren't any further questions, that brings me to thank Dr. Harun Bashir for his wonderful presentation, very informative presentation, and as Dr. Ali Zabujani said, it was also a very well made and well presented point as well. So thank you so much, Dr. Bashir, for that. Thank you. And
sorry, just
close, yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say thank you all. Thank you so much. I know I rushed through a lot in a short time, but thank you for kind of sticking around and engaging. Yeah, I mean, just Ramadan Mubarak to everyone, and thank you once again to the Mahdi Institute for inviting me.
Thank you. And as you mentioned earlier on before your presentation, that inshallah in the near future, once this episode lifts away, inshallah, we'll have you in person at the Al-Mahdi Institute as well, inshallah.
Inshallah. Jazakumullah khair.
Well, on that note, as I close this particular event, just to remind all the attendees that our next research seminar will take place on Thursday, again at 3 o'clock, Thursday, the 20th of May. That will be our final research seminar for this academic semester and therefore for this academic year as well. It'll be entitled Gender and Legal Personhood in Hanafi Law, and will be presented by Dr. Sadia Yaqub of Williams College. So again, that's Thursday, the 20th of May, 3 p.m. So we look forward to having you all then, inshallah. Until then, once again, have a wonderful rest of the month of Ramadan, and do keep us in your prayers. Thank you.